The Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum honored the prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges who fought for justice following the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995, with the 2015 Reflections of Hope Award. The award is accompanied by a $25,000 prize, which this year will establish an endowment for the director at the Judge Alfred P. Murrah Center for Homeland Security Law and Policy at Oklahoma City University School of Law. Former U.S. Deputy Attorney General Jamie Gorelick, who served under Janet Reno and assembled the prosecution and defense teams, was the keynote speaker at the award luncheon.
I'd like to share a little bit of my own recollections of what happened 20 years ago, and maybe talk a little bit about some reflections. On the morning of April 19th, 1995, I was, unusually for me, incommunicado. As the number 2 person at the Justice Department, one of my jobs was the national security portfolio, and I was taking a classified briefing in a place where I had no beeper. No, that was all we had. We didn't have cell phones, so we just had these little pagers, but I didn't even have that. And but my staff found me and told me that something really bad had happened here in Oklahoma City. And I got down to my office and saw pretty quickly the pictures on CNN of the smoldering Murrah building. Now, no sooner had I arrived in my office than I got a call from Rahm Emanuel, who you may know as the mayor of Chicago, but he was, at the time, he was a principal aide to President Clinton. And he is on the phone asking me what is happening and what I am doing about it. And I guess I seemed too calm for him. I try to stay calm in an emergency, because he said, "This is big," as if I needed to be told that. So I was, I took it in. The scene, of course, on the television was horrific. Merrick Garland, whom you saw up here a minute ago, was my principal deputy, and he's now the chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. And he was reaching out to the U.S. Attorney's Office, to the FBI here in Oklahoma, and to the DEA, and the reports were chilling. Our people in Oklahoma City were stunned, and we couldn't even raise the DEA because their office had been blown up. Attorney General Reno immediately asked us to be hands-on. And we immediately were in contact with Director Free at the FBI to talk about who was already on scene and who we could get here, who was en route. Soon we were in close contact with Governor Keating, and I want to say that we were lucky, very lucky, to have as your governor at that time someone who'd been in law enforcement, who'd worked in Washington in the law enforcement agencies. And we set out to make sure that the response was as cohesive as it could be, given that we had a crime scene and a rescue and recovery scene in the same place. Obviously, the fire department and the police department here were present on scene, the state police, the FBI, the ATF, and many others. And I remember watching the television reporting with Merrick, and when we saw the pictures of the little children being pulled out of that building, both of us had kids about the ages of the kids in the daycare center, and we were just sick to our stomachs. And Merrick said, I need to go. Send me. I need to go. Now, I needed him in Washington. He was my right arm. He was one of Attorney General Reno's most important aides, but we needed him here. And he got on a plane and was here, I think, within 36 hours. Donna Buscella from Maine Justice had gone the very day and had helped set up the office here. And our purpose was in making sure that every search warrant, every subpoena was right, that every agent was doing the right role for the case. and that I knew of any problems that needed to be fixed in Washington. So when the ATF and the FBI disagreed on who should have the lead on what part of the investigation, that was my job to deconflict that. So Merrick worked closely with Bob Ricks and Weldon Kennedy of the FBI, making sure that everything was being done correctly. We mobilized every resource we could, from the folks who worked on victim assistance to our agents and prosecutors. We worked with the Bureau to make sure that we had the very best people here on scene as soon as possible. And ultimately, we had 400 agents and 6 U.S. attorneys' offices involved in every aspect of the case. Now, Carrie asked me to explain about the U.S. attorneys' offices. Those of you who are not familiar with federal law enforcement and federal prosecutors may not know this, but U.S. attorneys are technically in a reporting line to the Attorney General, so through me, because I was the deputy. But the reality is that U.S. attorneys are selected by their senators and are confirmed by the Congress. So I like to say that they think really that they report only to God. And so getting them to salute and provide a cohesive approach to this case, one set of rules, one person who can say yay or nay on an investigative step was tough. But they did it. When you think about where this case took us, it took us to Michigan, to New York, to Florida, to Arizona. We had active investigations in so many parts of this country, and we did it together. Now, my job was to protect those who were here on the ground so that they could do their jobs. The president, as you've no doubt seen, President Clinton had an intense and quite understandable interest in what had happened, and he wanted to be briefed really every minute on what was going on. And just after the bombing, I mean, within about 45 minutes, I was asked to come to the White House and explain what we were doing and how we were doing it. And I got there. We gathered in Leon Panetta's office. Leon was the president's chief of staff at the time. Most recently was Secretary of Defense. And I said to him, they had said, come and bring the FBI leadership. And I said, I'm coming and they're staying. And I got there and I said, look, we are going to solve this case. We are going to find out who did this and bring them to justice, but we need some space. Now, I hoped that I was right in making that promise. As you can imagine, I'm saying to the President of the United States, back off, we'll take care of it. And as I said, I hoped that would be true, and I knew that the Justice Department and the FBI were open to the task. The president, though I have to say, gave us every resource we asked for. He focused on helping Oklahomans feel that the country was with them and that we were all rowing in the same direction, pulling together. In that first month, we worked around the clock, and I have to say, Carrie, when I go through the museum and see all the investigative steps that were taken really in those first 3 weeks, it's no wonder we were working around the clock. There was a lot to do. I remember, I personally hardly came home from the office, and I remember one night coming home very, very late. I always tried to at least look at my children in the course of a day, and I went into my 7-year-old son's room, and that was maybe 4 or 5 days into it, and he woke up and he said, "Mom, did you get the bad guys?" And I said, "We are, son, and we're doing it." And that was so motivating to me that my son had seen what had happened to those kids and wanted me to be gone so that we would get the people, the bad guys, in his view, who did this. So after a false start where the Bureau thought that a Palestinian American who had boarded a flight soon after the bombing was the perpetrator, we did get the guys who did it. We all benefited from terrific law enforcement work on the ground and the thoroughness of the evidence review on the site. And soon the case against Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols would develop. Within a month, we had almost all of the evidence that we used at trial. The Attorney General, who I know would have loved to have been here, she's too ill to travel, but this city and this state meant a tremendous amount to her. She was clear to us in what our mission was, that our investigation and our prosecution were to be models of American justice. Attorney General Reno led with her values, and her values said, we are going to show those who had been calling us in law enforcement jackbooted thugs, those who said that we were tyrants, that they were mistaken about American justice. We wanted the American people to see us as we saw ourselves, people who cared about civil rights and civil liberties and process, even as we were apprehending bad actors and bringing them to justice, that we were respectful of the rule of law, even as we were holding people accountable. We wanted our team to embody and express in the courtroom those same values. We were going to show American justice at its best, and we wanted an error-free trial that would stand the test of appeals and the test of time. And finally, we were going to do what we could to help Oklahoma heal. Soon we were picking a trial team, and we wanted the best in the nation, and the best in the nation showed up. Everyone wanted to be on this team. We ultimately picked the wonderful Joe Hartzler, who could speak from his heart and who could speak from the heartland in the courtroom. And Beth Wilkinson and Sean Connolly and Larry Mackey and Eitan Goldman and Jamie Ornstein, they formed, and so many others, they formed a perfect team with Pat Ryan and the prosecutors here in Oklahoma. At the same time, there was an awful lot to be done in Washington. First of all, the president asked that we review the security of every federal facility in the country, which was an enormous task in a very short period of time. Second, as you may know, Congress can't apprehend malfeasors. They can't investigate, they can't arrest, they can't issue search warrants. So they asked questions about whether we had done our job properly. Did the FBI have the right guidance in doing domestic terrorism investigations? Now, those FBI guidelines walked a very thin line, a difficult line, between permitting it to investigate someone who advocated the use of force and preventing it from basing an investigation on protected speech alone. Congress also took a new interest in the anti-terrorism legislation that we had proposed. In February of 1995, we proposed anti-terrorism legislation that would give us additional authorities. I was actually the point person, the person who testified. And in February of 1995, we were basically attacked from the left and the right by members of Congress saying we were asking for too much authority and that we were threatening civil rights and civil liberties. As soon as the bomb went off, there was a stampede to support the bill. We also poured our resources into helping the victims and their families. Our Office of Victim Assistance came here in full force, meeting with the families, explaining their role in the judicial process, offering help. Now, our bond with the families was tested when we had to move the trial out of Oklahoma to Denver. And it was further tested when we had to take positions that some considered to be, on what some people considered to be elaborate defense requests, demands for extraordinary expenditures, and ultimately 2 separate trials. Judge Mage was meticulous in his fairness to the defendants. We also wanted that process to be and to seem to be fair. And eventually, I think the families came to understand that we would all benefit from proceedings that could withstand scrutiny. Those trials were full and fair, all of those trials. I think that the Justice Department acquitted itself beautifully, and its actions indeed have withstood the test of time. So here are my reflections on this 20 years out. First, it's so important that we have an inclusive society, one in which we listen to one another, and that, I think, is one of the key messages of your wonderful museum. I kept asking myself during the investigation, how can it be that an American so demonized people because they worked for the federal government, that he could not see the humanity of the individuals whose lives he was about to take? I could not understand that. My second observation is that in contrast to the malevolence of Tim McVeigh and the people who helped him, the American people in their response to this attack were wonderful. They showed their inherent goodness. The outpouring of love and support that the people of this community received and that the people of this community gave was extraordinary in its depth and its breadth, and it was a breath of fresh air for our contentious society. Third, I'm enormously proud of the Department of Justice, which acquitted both the lives that were lost that day and our system of justice. And finally, I would say that the story of the bombing in Oklahoma City is in some way the story of our country's struggle to balance security and liberty. When we are afraid, we constrain civil liberties. When we are not as afraid, we constrain the government. That pendulum has swung many times, even in just my lifetime. In the 1950s, the country feared communism and tried to root it out. But then came the revulsion of the demonization of people for their beliefs and the tactics that were used to root out communists. In the 1960s and the 1970s, our security agencies became worried about threats to our security from the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. But their surveillance tactics ultimately proved much more frightening than the security fears. The ensuing reforms reined in the agencies. But when the nation was attacked here in Oklahoma, the country worried that we'd shackled the FBI, so the constraints were loosened. And the same thing happened after 9/11, when people wanted to know who to blame for that tragedy. We questioned the limits that had been imposed on the FBI and on our national security agencies, and we passed the Patriot Act. But after the threat seemed to subside, then we questioned the Patriot Act, and it became the focus of concern. Had we given the government too much power? And that same dynamic has occurred in the aftermath of the Snowden leaks, which may now lead to new constraints on our national security community. I was talking about this with a very good friend of mine who's been in this environment, this national security environment, for most of his life. And he said that his work and his career can be reduced to two questions. Why didn't you protect us? And you did what? The legal community here in Oklahoma has rightly focused over the last few days on this pendulum swing between liberty and security. And some of us here today have participated in conversations at the new Murrah Center that is going to be examining these questions. I think there is no better memorial to the victims of the bombing than to provoke and maintain this fundamental conversation about how to have both. And I want to thank you for letting me and my colleagues be part of it. Thank you very, very much.